unaware she was the billionaire's fiancée. The little girl's voice was barely a whisper. It didn't rise above the hum of the air conditioning or the distant clinking of dishes being washed down the hall. It was soft, uncertain, the kind of sound that a busy person walks right past without hearing. But Nicholas heard it. He had been standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows of his living room, staring out at the city below, phone in hand, mid-sentence on a call worth more than most people made in a decade. His jaw had been tight, his voice clipped, his posture, the posture of a man who had learned to keep everything, absolutely everything, at arm's length. And then the whisper came. "Can I hug you, miss?" He turned slowly, almost against his will, like something had pulled at him from the inside. The little girl, 3 years old, dark curls loose around her face, wearing a tiny yellow dress that had been washed so many times it had faded to the color of old sunlight, was standing at the edge of the hallway. Her small hands were clasped together in front of her chest, almost like she was praying. Her wide brown eyes were not looking at Nicholas. They were looking past him, at the woman standing a few feet to his left. The woman who had gone very, very still. Ava. She was holding a stack of freshly laundered towels against her chest like a shield. Her face, usually composed in the careful, neutral way of someone who had learned not to show too much, had cracked open slightly. Just slightly. The way a window cracks when the pressure outside changes. She was looking at the child the way someone looks at something they are terrified to want. And the child was looking at her like she had already decided. Nicholas lowered his phone without ending the call. The voice on the other end continued talking numbers, projections, timelines. He heard none of it, because in that moment, something in the room had shifted. Some invisible weight had been placed on the floor between all three of them, and no one knew quite yet what it was, or whether they were ready to pick it up. Ava's lips parted. She didn't speak. The little girl waited, her small fingers still pressed together, her expression patient in the way that only very young children can manage, completely open, completely without armor. And Nicholas stood between them like a man who had just walked into a room and realized, too late, that everything he thought he understood about his own life was about to be rearranged. Who was this child? Why was Ava looking at her like that? And why, did it feel like the answer was going to cost him something he hadn't even known he was carrying? The thing about Ava was that she never asked for anything. In the 4 months since she had started working in Nicholas Harmon's penthouse, managing the household, overseeing the cleaners, coordinating with his personal chef, quietly keeping the entire infrastructure of his private life from unraveling, she had made herself into something close to invisible. Not in a wounded way, in a practiced way. The way a person becomes invisible when they have learned that taking up too much space leads to trouble. She arrived at 7 in the morning. She left at 6 in the evening. She said good morning and yes, sir, and I'll have that taken care of. She never lingered near the kitchen table when Nicholas was eating. She never made eye contact longer than necessary. She never, not once, sat down in any of the rooms she spent her days cleaning. Nicholas had noticed this somewhere in the back of his mind. The way she seemed to erase herself. It had registered as efficient, professional, appropriate. He had not thought much more about it than that, until he had come home early one Tuesday, a meeting canceled, an afternoon unexpectedly returned to him, and heard something from down the hall that stopped him at the front door with his keys still in his hand. Humming. Soft, low humming, and beneath it the tiny sound of a child's voice saying something in that half-language that toddlers use when they are deep in the middle of play. He had walked toward the sound the way a person walks toward warmth in winter, without deciding to, without thinking. And he had stopped outside the doorway of the guest room that was never used and looked in. Ava was on her knees on the floor, a small pile of folded laundry beside her, and a little girl was sitting across from her, both of them bent over something, a drawing it looked like, made in crayon on the back of a piece of printer paper. Ava was pointing at something on the page. The child was nodding very seriously. Neither of them heard him. And then the little girl looked up from the drawing and said, quietly, with enormous gravity, Is this where you work, Mama? Ava had gone still. Nicholas had stepped back from the doorway. Mama. He stood in the hallway, with that single word sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading out, changing the shape of things. She had a child, and from somewhere just behind that thought. Why didn't I know that? Ava Reyes woke every morning at 5:15. Not because an alarm told her to, but because her body had been trained by years of necessity into a kind of permanent alertness, the low-level vigilance of someone who could not afford to oversleep, to be late, to give anyone a reason to let her go. She would lie still for a few seconds first. In the dark of the small room, she had 2 buses. She would listen. The sound of Aria's breathing from the toddler mattress on the floor beside her bed. Steady, soft, the most important sound in her life. Then she would get up. She had the routine down to a kind of art form by now. Shower in under 8 minutes. Dress without turning on the overhead light, so Aria could keep sleeping. Prepare a small container of cut fruit and crackers and leave it on the nightstand where Aria could reach it when she woke. Write the note. She always wrote a note, even though Aria could not yet read, and prop it against the fruit container. Good morning, my love. I'll be back by dinner. Mrs. Paulson is next door if you need anything. I love you to the moon. Then she would go downstairs, say good morning to Mrs. Paulson, who was retired and kind and charged less than any proper daycare, and she would walk to the bus stop in whatever the weather was doing, and she would ride across the city in the early quiet, and she would become, for the next 11 hours, exactly what she needed to be. The maid, the housekeeper, the woman who kept things running. She was good at her job, genuinely good at it. She had a talent for order, for anticipating what was needed before it was asked for moving through space without disturbing it. Her previous employer had called her the best they'd ever had, and then, when the family had relocated, given her a reference letter so glowing it had gotten her this job without much interview to speak of. She had not told Nicholas she had a daughter. Not because she had lied, because no one had asked, because the job posting had not asked about dependents, because she had learned through one previous employer and then another that the moment you became a person with complications, a sick parent, a custody issue, a child who sometimes got fevers on workdays, you became a liability, a risk, a problem. And she could not be a problem. She could not afford to be. So she kept Aria in a separate compartment of her life, sealed and protected, and she went to work and she came home and she held her daughter for as long as she could before bedtime, reading the same 3 picture books over and over until Aria fell asleep with her small hand still wrapped around one of Ava's fingers. It was a thin life, in some ways, but it was hers. And Aria was safe. And that was enough. It had to be enough. Nicholas Harmon had a penthouse with 7 rooms, and he lived in approximately 1.5 of them. The bedroom, the home office, the kitchen, reluctantly, when the chef was off and he needed coffee. The living room sometimes, when he had calls to take and needed to pace. The rest of the apartment, the formal dining room, the second sitting room, the guest suite, the library that the decorator had designed and filled with books he had never opened, existed in a state of perfect, untouched stillness. Rooms that served no purpose except to demonstrate that a man of his position had space to spare. He was aware, dimly, of how hollow this was. He was 34 years old, and he owned 4 companies and had been featured on the cover of 2 business magazines in the past year, and he had not, in longer than he could clearly remember, sat down with another person and felt anything close to ease. His engagement to Ava, to the Ava of his business world, the Ava Chun who was the daughter of his most important investor, had been announced 4 months ago at a dinner he barely remembered. She had been pleasant, composed. They had shaken hands at the end of the evening. He had not seen her since. His assistant managed the engagement, sent flowers on her birthday, coordinated appearances. He existed in the relationship the way he existed in most things, efficiently and at a careful remove. He was not a cold man, exactly. He had not always been this way. There had been a version of him, younger, less guarded, who had felt things easily. Too easily, maybe. who had let people in and been broken open by the experience and had decided, somewhere along the way, that the cost was too high. Now he ran meetings. Now he made decisions. Now he sat in his 7-room penthouse in the evenings and watched the city lights and felt, in a way he would never have admitted to anyone, profoundly and inexplicably alone. He had started coming home early more often. He hadn't quite acknowledged to himself why. The first time Arya came to the penthouse, it was an accident. Or what Ava presented as an accident, her face carefully still, her voice careful and controlled as she stood in the kitchen doorway that Thursday morning and explained that her usual childcare arrangement had fallen through. Mrs. Paulson had taken ill, and she had been unable to find an alternative on short notice, and she understood completely if this was a problem. She would make other arrangements immediately. She was so sorry to impose. "It's fine," Nicholas had said. He had not planned to say it. He had been half reading something on his phone, and the words had come out before he'd fully processed the question. But he said it, and then he looked up and saw the child standing behind Ava's legs, peering around at him with enormous dark eyes. He looked back down at his phone. "Just keep her out of the office wing," he said, and walked away. Arya did not stay out of the office wing. Not because she was disobedient. She was, Ava would later tell him, remarkably good-natured child. But she was 3, and 3-year-olds do not fully grasp architectural boundaries, and at some point mid-morning Nicholas looked up from his desk to find a small person standing in his doorway holding a drawing she had made in crayon, a large orange circle with several lines coming out of it, which he would later learn was meant to be the sun, regarding him with an expression of calm, absolute seriousness. He stared at her. She stared at him. "This is for you," she said, and walked forward and placed it on the corner of his desk with great ceremony, and then turned around and walked back out. Nicholas looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he picked it up and set it against the base of his monitor and went back to work. He did not throw it away. The second time was the following Tuesday. Ava had managed to bring Arya again. Mrs. Paulson still unwell, her apologetic look perfected now, and Nicholas had said it's fine again before she finished the sentence. He had been busy and slightly irritated and not at all prepared for what happened at lunch. He had come to the kitchen for coffee. Arya was sitting at the kitchen island, the one Nicholas had never sat at, eating a small bowl of pasta that Ava had cooked for her. She had pasta sauce on her chin. She was very focused on her bowl. Nicholas poured his coffee. "Do you like pasta?" Arya asked, without looking up. He paused. "I haven't had pasta in a while." She considered this. "That's sad," she said. He looked at her. She looked up then, her dark eyes finding his with the directness that small children have before they learn to second-guess themselves. "Pasta makes me happy," she explained. "You should eat some." He almost smiled. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her bowl. Nicholas stood there for another few seconds before he realized he was waiting for her to say something else. He took his coffee and went back to his office. But it was the third time, the rainy Friday, 2 weeks later, that something actually shifted. Nicholas had come home earlier than usual to find the penthouse quiet, and had gone looking, and had found Ava in the guest room doorway with an expression he couldn't read. He had looked past her into the room. Arya was curled up asleep on the small settee in the corner, one of Ava's cardigans draped over her like a blanket, a picture book open on the floor beside her where it had slipped from her hands. Ava was watching her with an expression that Nicholas had never seen on a person's face, not directed at him, not directed at anything he had ever been a part of. Something entirely unguarded, something fierce and tender, and exhausted all at once. She heard him and turned, and the expression closed up instantly, replaced by the composed professional face. "She fell asleep," Ava said. "I'll keep her quiet until—" "Let her sleep," Nicholas said. A pause. "She can sleep," he said again, and went to the kitchen, and stood there for a while, his coffee cooling in his hands, wondering why his chest felt strange. He found out about areas farther the way he found out most things he wasn't supposed to know, by being in a place no one expected him to be. He had come back downstairs for something, a file, he thought, or maybe he'd simply been unable to stop pacing his office, and the kitchen light was on and Ava was sitting at the island. This was so unusual, so outside the established pattern of her behavior, that he stopped in the hallway. She was on the phone. Her voice was low, controlled, but there was something in it that made him stay still. "I told you not to call this number," she was saying.
No.
"No, that's not. Listen to me. You don't get to show up. You gave that up." A pause. "She is fine. She doesn't ask about you."
A beat.
"That's your answer." Then the call ended. Ava set her phone down on the counter with great care, the way you set something down when you're trying not to throw it. She sat with her shoulders pulled tight for a long moment. Then she seemed to sense something and turned. She saw Nicholas in the doorway. For a second, neither of them spoke. Her face had gone through 3 different expressions in quick succession before it landed on controlled and cautious. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'll get out of here." "You don't have to," he said. She looked at him. "Get out," he clarified. "You don't have to." Another silence. He moved to the coffee machine. It was past 10, and he didn't need coffee, but he needed something to do with his hands. And she stayed on the stool, and they existed in the same room without either of them leaving, which was more than they'd ever done before. "He wants to see her?" Nicholas asked, without looking up from the coffee machine. A long pause from Ava. "He wants what she represents," she said carefully. "Now that her grandfather has money. Now that it's worth something to him." Nicholas didn't say anything. He let that land. "Her grandfather," he said after a moment. "My father. He and Aria's father were in business together." A brief, humorless exhale. "That's how we met. And how it ended." She said it simply, without self-pity, without asking for anything from him. Just information. Just the shape of a thing that had happened. He looked at her then. She was looking at the countertop. "She doesn't know him," Ava said. "She never has. She's never asked." A pause. "She might one day."
He thought about that.
He thought about being a child and asking questions and getting answers that hurt. "She has you," he said. Ava's hands moved slightly on the counter. "She has me," she agreed. Her voice was very quiet. He learned the rest more slowly, in pieces. The way you learn about a person not because they are telling you their story, but because they are simply living near you and life has edges. Her mother had died when she was 22. Her father had remarried. The money was recent, a late career investment that had paid off enormously, and it had changed the family structure in ways that still seemed to pain her. She was not estranged from her father, but she was something adjacent to estranged. Something careful and conditional. She had taken the job because she was good at it, and because it paid enough, and because the reference letter had made it possible. She had not known, when she accepted the position, who her employer was engaged to. He found that out on a Thursday in early November, 3 weeks after the rainy Friday, when his assistant emailed him with a reminder about the investor dinner, and he clicked through the attached bio to refresh his memory. Ava Chun, 26. Father, James Chun. He sat with that for a long time.
Ava.
His fiancée's name was Ava. He had a housekeeper named Ava. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and something in the way she moved, the way she held herself, registered in him differently now. She turned and saw him looking at her and said, "Is something wrong, Mr. Harmon?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. "No," he said. "Nothing." But his hands were not quite steady when he picked up his coffee cups. The investor dinner was on a Friday. Nicholas knew by Wednesday that Ava, the Ava he was engaged to, the Ava Chun who was James Chen's daughter, would be there. That they would be photographed together. That it would likely be the first time he'd seen her since the engagement was announced. He also knew, by Wednesday, that the woman who showed up every morning at 7 o'clock to run his household was named Ava Reyes. Not Ava Chun. Different women. Different people. He had worked himself into a kind of tension about something that, when laid out plainly, was simply a coincidence of first names. But it didn't feel simple, because on Thursday morning, he was in the kitchen when Ava arrived, and without entirely meaning to, he said, "The investor dinner tomorrow. James Chin will be there." He watched her face. She stopped moving, just for a fraction of a second. Then she continued setting down her bag, and she said, with perfect composure, "I see. Do you need anything specific prepared for the evening?"
Ava, he said.
She looked at him.
James Chun, he said.
"He's your father." The silence was total. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that went through careful composure and out the other side of it into something more honest. Something tired.
Yes, she said.
"You knew who I was," he said, "when you took the job." "I found out 2 weeks in," she said. "I looked up the engagement announcement." A pause. "I needed the job." He processed this. "You could have said something." To say what? Her voice was even, not defensive, just genuinely asking. "That your housekeeper is your fiancé's half-sister?" She paused, and he saw it register on both of them at the same moment. The word she had used. Half. "My father and I are not close. Ava and I have met twice. I did not think it was relevant. And now." She held his gaze. "Now you know. If you want me to leave, I understand." He turned away and stood looking out the kitchen window. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that the ground had just shifted under both of them. "You're not leaving," he said. He said it without turning around. He didn't see her expression. He didn't need to. He heard the slow breath she let out, the kind of breath a person releases when they have been holding something for a very long time. The investor dinner was not a disaster. That would have been easier to manage. It was something more uncomfortable than a disaster. It was a dinner at which everything was technically fine and nothing was right at all. Ava Chun was exactly as the bio had suggested.
Composed.
Educated. Gracious. She wore a dress that had cost more than Ava Reyes made in 2 months, and she laughed at appropriate moments and said the right things to the right people and looked at Nicholas with the pleasant, slightly appraising look of a person who has been told they're going to be married to someone and has decided to approach the situation as a project to be managed. He recognized the strategy because he used it himself. They stood next to each other for photographs. Her arm through his felt formal. He smiled when the cameras required it. James Chin spoke to Nicholas for 20 minutes in a corner, and the conversation was all business. Returns, projections, market confidence, what the engagement represented for both their companies, and Nicholas stood there and listened and felt, increasingly, a cold clarity about what this was. He drove home afterward and sat in the car outside his building for longer than necessary. He thought about Ava Reyes sitting at the kitchen island with her phone face down and her shoulders tight. He thought about the way she looked at her daughter. He thought about what he was doing. The next morning, Aria was there again. She came in with her mother carrying a small backpack covered in cartoon stars, and she went, with great purpose, directly to the kitchen island and climbed up onto the stool and sat there as though she had always lived there, arranging a small collection of crayons on the counter surface with the serious energy of someone setting up a workspace. Nicholas, coming through for coffee, stopped. "Are you drawing?" he asked. "I'm making a book," Aria said, without looking up. "It has a dog in it." "What kind of dog?" She looked up then, delighted that he had asked. "A big fluffy one."
White.
"His name is Cloud." He got his coffee. He sat down on the stool 2 spaces away from her, something he had never done before, and watched her draw. She narrated as she worked. The dog named Cloud had a house and a family and a yard with a tree and apparently also a small boat, though the boat's relevance to the story was unclear. Ava came into the kitchen, saw Nicholas sitting at the island, and stopped. She recovered quickly. She went to the refrigerator. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency. But he noticed that she didn't leave the kitchen. "Mama," Aria said, without looking up from her drawing. "What's that word? When something feels like home, but it isn't your home yet?" Ava paused with her hand on the refrigerator door. Nicholas was quiet. I don't think there's a word for that, Ava said softly. There should be, Arya said, with complete seriousness, and went back to Cloud the dog. Nicholas looked at the drawing. He looked at the space between Ava's shoulders, that careful tension she carried, and something in him hurt in a way he didn't quite have language for either. He stayed at the island until Arya finished the first page of her book. The call from James Chun came that afternoon. It was brief and direct, which was James's style, really clear on that Ava Reyes was working in the penthouse. He did not call her his daughter. He said that woman with a particular weight, and he said that given the current business situation and the nature of the engagement, he would strongly prefer that the arrangement be reconsidered. Nicholas sat very still while James talked. I'll take that under advisement, he said, and ended the call, and sat there. Ava had a mother who was gone and a father who called her that woman and had never, not in 4 months, asked Nicholas for a single thing except to be allowed to do her job. He thought about what he was about to do, or not do. He thought about what it would cost and who would pay the price. He didn't tell her about the call. Not that day. Not the next. He watched her move through the apartment in her quiet, efficient way, and he felt the weight of what he knew and hadn't said, and it sat badly with him, the way unfinished things do when they belong to someone else's life. On the 3rd day, Arya came again. She appeared in his office doorway the way she had the first time, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had a standing appointment, and she held up a piece of paper with both hands. It was a completed page of the Cloud book. He found his family, she said solemnly. He was lost, but then he found them. Nicholas looked at the drawing. Cloud the dog was drawn in the center of the page, large and white and surrounded by smaller figures. Other dogs, it looked like, and a house and a tree, and what might have been a boat again, or possibly a leaf. He looks happy, Nicholas said. He is, Arya said. He was scared before, but not anymore. She placed the page on his desk with the same ceremony as the first drawing. Then she looked at him, directly, seriously, in that way she had, and she said, Are you scared? He looked at her, a 3-year-old, looking at him with genuine, uncomplicated curiosity. Sometimes, he said, because it was the only honest answer. She nodded as though this was acceptable information. Mama gets scared too, she said. But she holds my hand, and then it's okay. Then she turned around and walked out. Nicholas sat without moving for a long time. He thought about the investor dinner. He thought about Ava Chen's professional smile and James Chen's voice saying that woman. He thought about 2 completely different kinds of loneliness and about which one he had chosen and which one had been chosen for him. He thought about Ava Reyes at 5:15 in the morning, writing a note her daughter couldn't yet read. I love you to the moon. He picked up his phone. He set it back down. He picked it up again. He called his attorney. He came home on a Friday. Not early. Not with any announcement. Just home, at the usual hour, on a usual day, except that he had done 2 things that week that had not been usual at all, and he knew it, and he was still unsettled by his own decisions in the way of a man who has operated on logic for so long that acting on something else feels like walking with uneven ground. He came through the door, and the apartment smelled like dinner. Ava had cooked, which she sometimes did at end of the week, and there was a sound from the living room that stopped him. Ava's voice, low, reading aloud, and Arya's breathing, slow and sleepy. He set his things down quietly. He moved toward the living room. Ava was on the floor, sitting on the floor, which he had never seen her do in any of the common spaces, with her back against the couch, Arya curled against her side, most of the way to sleep. A picture book was open in Ava's hands. She was reading the last page, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up when she heard him. Neither of them spoke. Arya was almost asleep. Her small hand had found the fabric of Ava's sleeve and was holding it loosely, the way sleeping children hold onto what they love. Nicholas crouched down. He was not sure why. It was not something he had planned, so that he was at their level, low to the floor, eye to eye with the child. Arya's eyes, half closed, found him. She blinked slowly. "You're home," she said. "The way you say something that is simply true. The way children say things that are simply true." He didn't answer.
He couldn't quite.
And then Arya, 3 years old, not fully awake, turned from him to Ava with the slow gravity of someone crossing a great distance, and she reached up and put her small arms around Ava's neck and pulled her close. And over Ava's shoulder, her dark eyes opened a little further and found Nicholas again, and she said, half into Ava's shoulder, "Can I hug you too, mister?" Not Mississippi. Not the whisper from the beginning of this story. Mister. Him. Ava went still. Nicholas did not move for a long moment. Arya was waiting, patient and sleep-soft and utterly without agenda, arms still around her mother's neck, looking at him with the simple open question of a child who has not yet learned that some people do not want to be reached. He leaned forward. He put his arms carefully around both of them. Arya made a small sound of satisfaction and closed her eyes. Ava did not move. She sat completely still inside the circle of his arms, and he felt the precise moment she stopped bracing, the slight drop of her shoulders, the tiny exhale, the very quiet unclenching of something she had been holding for a very long time.
They stayed like that.
No one spoke. The apartment held them. The quiet held them. Outside, the city went on being the city. Inside, something that had been cold for a long time got a little warmer. Nicholas pressed his eyes shut. He had not been held in longer than he could remember. He had not realized, until right now, how much he had missed it. On Monday morning, Nicholas was in the kitchen when Ava arrived. He had made coffee, 2 cups, which he had not done before, and one was sitting on the counter at the island, already the right shade, because he had paid attention. Ava came in and stopped when she saw the cup. He didn't look up from what he was reading. She sat down at the island and put it on it. On Wednesday, he had his assistant remove the investor dinner from his calendar and send Ava a brief, respectful, entirely honest note. He had reviewed the legal arrangement with his attorney. He had spoken, carefully and without anger, to James Chun. James Chun had not taken it well. Nicholas had not expected him to. He had expected it anyway. On Thursday, Arya arrived with a new chapter of the Cloud book and walked past the office doorway and then came back and stood in it and regarded Nicholas with her usual gravity. "You're working again," she said. "I am," he said. "Are you busy?" she asked. "Or just pretend busy?" He almost laughed. "What's pretend busy?" "When you look at the computer, but you're not really doing anything," she said. "Mama does it sometimes. When she's thinking about something." He looked at her. "I'm thinking about something," he admitted. She nodded. "Okay." She held up the book. "This chapter is when Cloud learns how to ask for help." "I'd like to hear it," he said. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk and read to him from the book, reading being, at this stage, a generous interpretation of what she was doing, which was mostly narrating what she had drawn, with great emotional investment and several invented plot developments. He listened to all of it. 2 weeks later, Ava came in on a Monday morning and found a key on the counter beside the coffee. She picked it up. A door key, labeled in Nicholas's handwriting with a single word and a small address. A unit in a building 12 minutes from the penthouse. Better school district. Proper kitchen. A room for Arya that was Arya's own. She stood at the counter for a long time. Then she put the key in her pocket and she made them both coffee, and she sat down at the island. And when Nicholas came in, she was still there, not hiding, not erasing herself, just present. He sat down across from her. They drank their coffee. The apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been. There are stories we carry with us for a long time, not because they are loud, not because they are dramatic or extreme or built for attention, but because they get something right, something quiet and true about the way people find each other across the distances they've built, and the walls they've learned to stand behind, and the surprising tenderness that breaks through when you least expect it. This was one of those stories. Arya, 3 years old, with her serious eyes and her dog named Cloud, did not know she was doing anything remarkable. She was simply being herself, which is the only magic children have and the most powerful one. She walked into rooms without armor. She asked questions without fear. She reached out and held on. And in doing so, she made space for two very guarded people to be just a little less guarded, a little more honest, a little more present with the people right in front of them. If something in this story reached you, if you recognized that particular ache of being capable of love but afraid of the asking, or the particular loneliness of a person who has made themselves small to survive, then you already know why stories like this matter. We tell them because we need them, because somewhere in the telling, we give each other permission to be the version of ourselves that knows how to lean in. If this moved, not because we're asking, but because there are more stories here, and they were made for people exactly like you. On a Sunday, months later, Nicholas sat on the floor of a living room that now held toys in a basket by the window and a drawing taped to the refrigerator and a small pair of shoes always somewhere near the front door. Arya was asleep with her head in Ava's lap, the cloud book face down on the carpet where she'd dropped it. Ava was looking out the window. Nicholas was looking at both of them. He thought about the first day, the whisper from the hallway, the small hands clasped together, the enormous waiting in those dark eyes. "Can I hug you, miss?" He hadn't known then what that question was the beginning of. He hadn't known that a 3-year-old's arms could reach further than all the careful architecture he'd built around himself. He hadn't known that the thing he'd been missing wasn't something you acquire or construct or close a deal on. It was this. Just this. A sleeping child. A woman who had been strong for long enough to be allowed to simply be still. A room that felt like something more than a room. He looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, Cloud the dog, surrounded by his family, safe inside the page.
He found his family.
He was lost, but then he found them. He thought, yes. He thought exactly that. Outside, the city did what cities do. Inside, there was warmth and the soft sound of breathing, and a boy who had been a man for a very long time slowly remembering how to be found. If this story stayed with you, you're not alone. We'll be back with another one soon. Because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that remind us we're human.